All right, class. So here we are once again with our discussion on contemporary Christian philosophers of significance. Now, we are going to be switching gears pretty heavily here in regard to school of thought and as it pertains to our thinkers here. Now, of course, we're not going to get to that particular aspect until later in the lecture. However, I do just want to go ahead and say that will be something that we will take a serious departure from most of our other thinkers in this regard. Now, having said that, let's look at our thinker here. Now, this is going to be philosopher Edward Feser. And currently he's in Pasadena City College out in California as of this recording. He's got his PhD in philosophy. And this is kind of an interesting subject here, this Feser character. Notably, because he was atheist. This particular thinker was an atheist for a significant portion of his life, which was roughly, as I recall him saying, basically all of the 90s. So the 1990s, that is. So during his tenure from his adolescent years all the way up to graduate school and college, and then doing his PhD work, and then as he began to actually teach philosophy, so goes his testimony here, going from his own account, is that it was during his graduate days as he was teaching philosophy that Feser would give the normal arguments for the existence of God in his introduction to philosophy classes, and then he would just stack them up and knock them down, as many philosophy professors are apt to do. However, he started to realize through the reading of these arguments, specifically the arguments of Aquinas, right? This is Feser is an Aristotelian Thomist philosopher. We'll get to that later. But he really started to notice that he wasn't being exactly fair to the argument. He was either giving a caricature or some sort of straw man version of these arguments. However, it was because that was how he had been taught them himself, right? So during this time, Feser investigates these arguments and reads the primary source material, which is, of course, always a good idea. And long story short, he actually becomes convinced by these arguments, these Thomistic arguments, these and a few others here and there. But essentially these classical Western philosophy arguments regarding the existence of God. He realizes that they're much stronger, much more substantial, much more robust than he had been led to believe throughout his education, and then stronger than what he himself had even thought as a result of that. And so he converts to Christianity. So there's an interesting that's an interesting, if not at worst, intriguing account just in regard to this particular philosopher. Now, as we want to say here on our nationality, obviously he's at Pasadena City College, and he was born and raised here in the United States as well. So this is another American or United States representative of a philosopher of easy for me to say, significance here. Now, I want to just go ahead and make a quick remark about last lecture in regards to Craig that I can't believe that I forgot to mention this, but just in regard to Craig's education. Like with Feser here, I noted that he, has finished his graduate studies and PhD in philosophy. However, Craig, as I should have noted, I can't believe I forgot to mention this, Craig has his doctorate in philosophy, but he also has a doctorate in theology. The fact that William Lane Craig carries two doctorates is, of course, as theists, as Christian theists, we shouldn't necessarily believe that makes anyone any better than another. However, just simply from an academic standpoint, an academic vantage point, that's very impressive to be able to put in the time and the effort and the ability to acquire 2 doctorates. That's just no small task. I mean, I'm still working. I finished up my MA and I'm working currently in the middle of my program for my PhD, and I couldn't imagine having to try to fight for another academic style of terminal degree. So hats off and much respect to Craig just in that regard. Now back to, but I just wanted to go ahead and mention that again. That's important. I should have mentioned that. But go ahead and going back to Feser here. So as we've mentioned here, as we've briefly discussed, his nationality, his background there is the United States. Now, let's look at some of the significant ideas, notable ideas here that Feser has presented. Now, this is going to tie in to some degree in regards to his school of thought. But his significant ideas have been, he has brought back, he has brought back much interest among philosophers of religion, among apologists of various stripes. These classical, old school, and when I say classical, old school, I mean in the tradition or in the vein of classical Western philosophy. Excuse me. I've got a mystery cough running around here somewhere. Now, when I say classical, old school arguments, I just mean to say that the classical Western philosophical school of thought. I don't want to say school of thought there because I don't want to confuse that with what we're about to mention later. But just that vein of philosophy, the classical Western heritage of philosophy. Now, these are significant because, as noted earlier, these were instrumental in Feser's own conversion. And because of that, Feser has dedicated quite some time to arguing, presenting these types of arguments, giving these types of arguments a fresh makeover, so to speak. That's not to say that he's changing the arguments from what they originally are. Of course, you can't do that, or you're not even talking about the argument. You're talking about some other argument. However, he's trying to dust them off and bring them back to the forefront in what he would argue is the rightful place that they should hold in these types of discussions and within the philosophy of religion and or apologetics. And what he's done by doing this is he's shown that so many, we can even say decades worth of caricatures of these arguments have been circulating, that many philosophy professors have either misunderstood the arguments or misrepresented the arguments or simply failed to engage with the actual argument as they were presented. So a classical example of this, an easy example of this would be to say that even someone like Bertrand Russell gets Aquinas wrong and Aristotle wrong in saying that, well, if everything that exists must have a cause, well, then it's just special pleading to say that God doesn't have a cause, right? I mean, because if everything must have a cause for its existence, well, then God must have a cause for his existence. However, if that's the case, and well, maybe everything doesn't need a cause for its existence, well, then we can just simply say the same thing in regard to the universe. And these are the types of just caricatures and straw men that Feser really reveals and has done great work in showing to be just complete misrepresentations of the arguments. Because, of course, Aquinas and Aristotle never claimed that simply that everything, if it exists, then it must have a cause, right? Because that would just be so obviously logically fallacious that no one would give it significant merit over the past 2,000, literally the past 2,000 years. No one would pay attention to such a thing. Now, so that's one particular thing that a significant idea that he's known for, and why he's made such a splash on the philosophical community and as it pertains to philosophy of religion. But the other would be simply his revival of, and this can't be accounted just by him specifically, but it could be argued that he's one of the figureheads of this, is that he has given rise to and has made popular once again the metaphysics of classical Western philosophy. And that is just to say the understanding of causality, as argued by Aristotle and Aquinas, that efficient, material, formal, and final causes actually exist, and that there really just is no explanatory power for any type of view that would just argue in terms of efficient and material causes. Now, those may be foreign to you, those concepts, if you haven't had another one of our philosophy courses, but that's okay. At this point, for the sake of this lecture, that's not necessarily that big a deal, because really the metaphysic behind all that for what Feser has revitalized is really what's important here. And that's just simply, again, to say that he's helped to revive this classical Western conception of philosophy, which would begin with metaphysics as opposed to beginning with epistemology, which is what most modern philosophy does, and that immaterial things such as forms and natures, final causality, really do exist within nature, and he's argued extensively in that regard. He's also been, again, a very, let's say it this way, lay-friendly proponent of the work of those that have gone before us, like Aquinas. So he even has a textbook out, and this will be just a nice segue into some of his notable works. So the first of these notable works would be something like this book, again, we would call Aquinas, a Beginner's Guide. Aquinas, a Beginner's Guide. And the reason this is notable is because, again, Feser is introducing not only this classical, Western, and again, when I say classical, I mean in the Western sense of philosophy, he's not only giving this classical conception of metaphysics, right? That is, what is real, what actually exists in terms of causality, efficient, material, formal, and final causality. But he's also talking about, and really just gives a fresh approach to what it means to just be human. So he talks about holomorphism, which is distinct from Cartesian dualism, right? Most Christian believers just assume, they presuppose that something like Cartesian dualism is true in regards to their own life and personality, meaning that you're not your body and your soul is not the body and the body is not the soul. There's these two radically distinct sorts of things involved there. And Feser argues for this classical conception of holomorphism, which is that your body is composed holomorphic, hence the name there, that your body is composed of both an immaterial aspect, the formal or nature or essence of you, and also the material aspect, right, the flesh that constitutes you. And there's some distinction there between holomorphism and Cartesian dualism. So again, that just goes deep into metaphysics. So of course, some of that may be difficult for you to understand at this point, and that's okay. We're just pointing out some of the ideas that he's brought back into the forefront in philosophy of religion and or theology, or even possibly apologetics. Now, that Aquinas guide is also, or Aquinas, a Beginner's Guide to Aquinas there, one of the other reasons why this is notable is simply because it goes to the traditional 5 ways of Aquinas' traditional 5 arguments for the existence of God. Again, this is where he dusts off those arguments. Doesn't doesn't make them new in the sense that he changes them. Otherwise, they just wouldn't be the arguments, right? However, he just defends them from the modern caricatures, the misrepresentations, and then updates some of the examples with better examples that would fit with what we know scientifically in our day and age. Very good, easy read for that. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but not necessarily. You don't have to be a professional to understand that text. It's good in that regard, very good in that regard. Aquinas, the Five Ways. Now, it could be argued, it could be argued that his most notable work is a very, 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 very lay-friendly and very pop-level book. And when I say pop-level, I don't mean unsubstantial. I just mean geared towards a popular audience. A book called The Last Superstition. Now, this book is a riot. This particular book was written at the height of what was called the New Atheists' popularity, right? The New Atheists being Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. And he writes this book in the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, somewhere in that area, maybe even 2008. But he writes this book at the height of their popularity, and it's just a scathing, not strictly speaking, satirical piece, but he definitely employs much satire, much dry humor, and at times it could almost disdain for the good or for the ill there, almost disdain for just the what he calls the intellectual shallowness of the new atheistic movement. So he goes through a lot of the things that we've discussed thus far. He gives pop-level versions of arguments that immaterial things such as forms and natures exist, meaning that materialism, physicalism must just be false by definition. He goes into a couple of these arguments that we talk about, specifically the Aristotelian first mover argument for the existence of God, while we would think that God would have to exist. He goes through, again, in mocking manner, right, the inadequacy of modern philosophy and why the Enlightenment was such an absolute dumpster fire, to use a very popular term there, yet crude in some sense. And he pulls no punches. It's even a book that you read and sometimes wonder, wait, I wonder if Feser's going a little overboard here, right? He's just not pulling any punches. One of the famous or infamous lines from the textbook there, from the book, The Last Superstition, depending on how you look at it, one of the most famous or infamous lines is, he just straight up says that Dawkins wouldn't know metaphysics from Metamucil, right? He can't even tell the difference between the two. So just lots of that type of material, yet very substantial philosophically speaking, very, very argument heavy. And I don't mean argument in the pejorative sense of the term. I mean in the philosophical, logical sense. Lots of arguments offered in that book against the new atheism and what he would consider to be just the absurdity of that position. So Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, The Last Superstition. And then also he's gotten quite popular for a book called Scholastic Metaphysics. And that's just, again, going back to this metaphysical issue of what really truly does exist, right? Or is it material, is it immaterial? Are there both material and immaterial realities? And this book, Scholastic Metaphysics, has made a big splash in the world of philosophy there. Now, when we look at his presentations and or debates, he is not necessarily known for much debate, really. However, he does have a few presentations where he talks and gives the same sorts of explanations to what we've discussed thus far in regard to his book, say like The Last Superstition, or in regard to the metaphysics of Thomism, or from the mind of someone like Thomas Aquinas. He gives lots of presentations in that regard. I'm sure that it would be very easy to pull a couple of these up on YouTube with Ed Feser. Excuse me. Now, I'm fighting all kind of battles here today, right? So that would be something that you would definitely want to check out there. Maybe some of these presentations just in your free time that I'm sure you have very little of. Perhaps you could check out some of these presentations. Again, not very big on debate. You're not going to find very few. You're going to find very few debates given by Ed Feser. In fact, the only one that I can even recall at this moment is a debate that he did with, I want to say, Sharif Ahmed on the unbelievable radio program with Justin Brierley out of the UK. Some of you may be familiar with that radio program, unbelievable. But they frequently will have high-profile individuals from each of the positions, such as theism, Christianity, atheism, skepticism, Gnosticism, those types of things, and everything in between there, and we'll give them a platform to debate one another. Now, a bit more could be said, but I would like to go ahead and look at this school of thought, right? What school of thought does Feser consider himself to flow within? Well, to a very large degree, Feser is not going to be what we would call a modern analytic philosopher, even though he was trained academically as a modern analytic philosopher, going to a modern analytic type of graduate program, right? However, he has become, since that time, what is called an Aristotelian or Thomistic philosopher in the school of thought of Aristotelian Thomism. Right, he's a Thomist. Feser would be considered a Thomist. Now, we're going to actually have a couple other philosophers that would fit in that mold as well. Norman Geisler would be one of them. Some can be more Thomistic than others. Right, so Feser would be, we consider Feser to be more of a true blue Thomist than someone like Geisler, though Geisler does lean towards, no doubt, would call himself a Thomist in some sort. And now these are the schools of thought, again, that I would say are different or clash sometimes in their answers, how they answer certain philosophical types of questions in regard to God or theology. They would answer questions differently than just a modern analytic philosopher, someone like William Lane Craig. In fact, if you've followed even a discipline like apologetics long enough, you've realized that the way that, or not even just the way that, but the specific answers that someone like a Norman Geisler might give, and someone like not a disciple, to use the word a little too strongly, but someone like just for sake of no better word at the moment, a disciple like Richard Howe, are going to answer questions, philosophical questions, on a much different from a much different perspective. They're coming from different schools of thought. And again, some of you may have picked up that, well, wait a minute, let's say you're an apologetics junkie out there, and you may have noticed that the way that Geisler might answer some kind of apologetic question that's philosophical in nature is going to be completely different than the way William Lane Craig might answer that question, even perhaps contradict the way that one or the other might answer whatever the question may be there, specifically in regards to the problem of evil. However, that's fine. We just want to point out that that's why these different answers are coming along, even in the realm of apologetics, because not everyone is working from the same school of thought. Again, Feser working from the school of thought of Thomism. And of course, that school of thought begins with Thomas, right? Thomas Aquinas, right? The medieval theologian and philosopher. However, even Aquinas picks that up from Aristotle, Aristotle's philosophy. Of course, it doesn't adopt completely Aristotle's philosophy. Thomas is a theist, a Christian theist. Aristotle is a Greek pagan, right? However, the school of Thomism would say that Aristotle and Aquinas and classical Western philosophy got so many things right in regards to metaphysics, in regards to epistemology, that this school of thought is still defensible, and very possibly, they would argue, the best account of reality that we actually have, would be something like this particular school of thought. And it openly embraces that it is a school of thought, unlike what we discussed in modern analytic philosophy earlier, saying, well, it's not necessarily so much a school of thought as it's just independent, and we judge arguments as they come based on their own merits. And Aristotelian Thomism, this school of thought says, well, it's really not that easy just to simply say you're going to look at an argument based solely and only on its own merit. You've already packed in all of these metaphysical ideas, all of these ontological ideas, all sorts of things like that that must be taken into account when we give answers, right, for particular questions and or topics. Now, to highlight, we have another American philosopher from the United States, significant ideas, a revival of Thomism in some sense, the school of thought of Thomism, largely responsible for that. They're not solely responsible, but largely responsible for that. Significant works being, because of these significant works, he helps to revive this sort of school of thought. And these significant works being The Last Superstition, Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, Scholastic Metaphysics. Oh, and I cannot believe this. I'm so glad I was doing a rundown here because I forgot to say this. One of the most significant works that he's written is a text called 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. Now, it's very important. These are not the 5 proofs of Aquinas. He does that in the book about Aquinas. These are actually different arguments. He would even say variations of a cosmological argument, given in the vein of different philosophers. So this book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, we actually discussed this in my Philosophy of Religion course at some length. He gives Thomistic arguments. He gives a rationalist form of argument. He gives a Neoplatonic form of argument. He gives all sorts of arguments from different thinkers and whatnot. But that was a very significant work. In fact, time may tell that it may be his most significant work. So I'm very glad that I was doing this run through and went back and remembered that. I was able to recall that. Now, so we have the significant works, not very much in regards to presentations, lots of presentations, but not very much in regards to debates. Not a very strong, it's funny to even say this nowadays in our current culture, but not a strong quote-unquote YouTube presence, right, in the debate world there on the web. And then school of thought is, again, of course, Thomism or Aristotelian Thomism in some sense. Excuse me. And with that said, we will wind up another one of our lectures. Trying to keep these short and sweet so you can just dive into your text here, as these are just overviews of different Christian thinkers. Until next time, adios, brothers and sisters.